Well, good morning. Thank you all for coming and joining us in this discussion, which is the third of three discussions here at the WISE 2012 Summit on the issue of learning societies forging new links. I'm Tony Jackson, Vice President for Education at the Asia Society, and I'm very pleased to be the moderator of this extremely distinguished panel. I want to turn to my colleagues in very short order, but since we have been discussing this issue of learning societies over the past 2 days, or more precisely the notion of learning ecosystems, I thought it might be useful to very briefly touch upon some points that were raised over the past days, specifically on what we mean by the term learning ecosystems. In fact, how that term has several meanings, or at least several different dimensions, and highlight just a few points on the seminal attributes of learning ecosystems that we will perhaps have a chance to explore in further depth today. But before that I do want to remind all of us here today that like all the debates, this is meant to be an interactive session. Your input is extremely valuable. So there will be two ways that we will bring your voices into this conversation. First, behind me, I believe, is the hashtag for Twitter. So I implore you to tweet at will, and I'll be trying to bring those comments into the discussion. And secondly, rather than wait until the end of the discussion to entertain your questions from the audience, I think we'll have a bit of discussion up here on the stage, and then we will turn to you for your comments and questions, and we'll kind of do that at intervals throughout the debate. But what is a learning ecosystem? Well, there are at least two interrelated ways to look at this idea. On the one hand, learning ecosystems refer to kind of tearing down the wall between formal learning, the learning that occurs in schools, and informal learning, the kind of learning that can occur in community centers or libraries, workplaces, online learning, mobile learning, and so on. So it's the notion of blended learning experiences that blend formal and informal learning opportunities for learners. Well, how is that different than the way we traditionally think of how learning occurs? I think the key shift here is that learning is centered around the learner rather than around the institutions or places of learning. It's the idea that a learner is situated within a network of learning resources, and learning, therefore, becomes an individual's navigation of that network toward the development of knowledge and skills and understanding. So learning isn't just going to school, rather a journey over time and a broad range of interactions between people, things, and ideas. So in this context, learning ecosystems embrace a view of learning as not being standardized by institutions to which the learner conforms. Rather, it holds the learner at the center of a universe of raw learning materials, if you will, with him or herself in charge of using these raw materials to build their own knowledge, customized to their own interests. And particularly with the availability of technology, learners can now access information and knowledge well beyond their own local environment, so that learning ecosystems can be both local and global at the same time. Now, learning ecosystems brings with it a second fundamental shift that is also particularly related to the opportunities created by communication technologies. And that's the idea of collective learning through open, participatory learning environments online. The fundamental shift here is from learner as kind of receiver of knowledge to learner as a contributor to knowledge. Crowdsourcing is one approach for this kind of collaborative learning, as is the idea of mass randomized trials where the scientific method of testing hypotheses under varying conditions is taken outside the laboratory and embedded within the populace, if you will, as a way of understanding cause and effect. And here, the idea is that rather than a person being at the center of a learning ecosystem, there is instead a problem of common interest to a wide range of potential learners and contributors, and all of them may be from different disciplines, different experiences, different backgrounds, cultures, a host of other variables. And one really interesting aspect of learning ecosystems thought of in this way as a sort of massive collective learning societies is that they have the potential, at least, to be self-correcting. That is, there is a kind of built-in feedback loop, or to take a different analogy, a continuation or a continuous upward spiral where successful iterations of ideas get more and more refined, or in fact, the edges of knowledge get pushed further and further out. Now, of course, there are interactions and intersections between this view of learning ecosystems as an individual system as well as a collective system. For example, when an innovation developed by an individual goes viral through digital interaction. So one person's discovery along their individual learning journey can become a nation or the world's new collective wisdom at breathtaking speed. But again, not as received wisdom, never to be again changed, rather wisdom in play among a vast array of contributing players. So that's just a start of what is meant by learning ecosystems that I will put in play with this group, and help us then go on to move forward in our debate this morning. So let me turn to our panel, and what I'd like each of you to do, if you would, is to introduce yourselves, and then I'd like you just to briefly say what your definition of a learning ecosystem is, or what its most important characteristics are, and then give us an example of a learning ecosystem to help us understand what you mean. So I'll start with you, Michelle, if you would.
Hello. My name is Michelle Sullinger. I'm the Director of Education Practice in Cisco's consultancy group, the Internet Business Solutions Group at Cisco. I agree with what you're saying about the child being a part of a global community, but at the end of the day, it's a personal thing. And for me, the ecosystem starts with the child and what a child needs to know in order to become a confident, self-reliant, responsible and resilient adult. And there are a number of factors that contribute to that. And the first one, obviously, is the ability to access your basic needs. And we know from all the things that we've been hearing here at this event that, access to safety, food, shelter, water are absolutely crucial before any learning can take place. And education for that isn't something that necessarily happens in school. It's part of the ecosystem that they need. And until they have those basics, then learning it's very difficult for the next stage to happen, which is really developing that toolkit of how to learn, how to access, how to interpret data, how to use information, media literacy, using and applying your knowledge, and then developing personal well-being and being able to maintain your health, being healthy, and then being able to communicate, collaborate, create, develop those skills of empathy and cooperation, and to be adaptable and entrepreneurial. So there are a number of things that a child needs to become, and that ecosystem is who are the people and the artifacts that will help them to become all of those things in those 5 areas that I've just spoken about. And I think the example I'm going to give is probably one which is one I've been involved in that's a slum community in Kenya, where the children are in an ecosystem that is really beginning to help them, but I think could do more. And we talked about this yesterday. And the ecosystem is one where there are 4 schools and 1 secondary school, 4 primary schools and 1 secondary school. There are 5,000 students. About 200 actually get to secondary school, and a few more get scholarships to go elsewhere. So they get a primary education, they get a feeding program, they have clean water, they have toilets. So some of those basic needs are being addressed. The basic needs that some of them are lacking in the slums in which they come from. And then they're taught by nuns. There's some funding from the state, and they're taught by teachers from the community. And that, but that we that's not enough to develop all the skills that we're talking about. They need teaching assistants who potentially come from the community, who understand the context, who understand the cultural nuances, who can support the teachers, people with secondary education, perhaps. They need community workers to link what they're doing in school with the community. They need potentially entrepreneurs to come and work with the children, to give them aspirations beyond. They need to have access to the best teachers through technology, through webcasting, bringing teachers in remotely to really help them feel valued. They need projects that not just develop their curricular skills, but develop their community. So those projects should be community-based, looking at improving the lives of the community, but at the same time bringing them together with the curriculum skills that they're going to need if they are going to progress with their education. So these are just some of the things. There obviously are others, but it's that just putting the child in the centre and growing them from within to become a responsible citizen and resilient is absolutely crucial to involve all those players.
Thank you, Michelle. Jeff?
Good morning. I'm Jeff Mulgan from the UK. I am what it says there. We have a series of overlapping words here: ecosystem, learning environment, learning network, learning community. I'm not sure I have a definition, but where this comes alive for me is through a few practical examples. So the first one is a network of schools which are being created in the UK called Studio Schools, the fastest growing network of new schools there, where most of the curriculum, 80%, is done through real-life practical projects. So that means automatically around the school you have a learning ecosystem with small businesses, charities and so on, setting tasks for children and a quite different relationship to perhaps a traditional school. The schools which are within the network then, 16 so far, another 16 opening next year, another 40 the year after, then also act as a learning ecosystem themselves. A second very different example is the network of social innovators worldwide called SIX, which is about 5,000 social innovators trying to learn together about the practical jobs of innovating in education or health, agriculture. And a third field I'm involved in is policymakers in government. And bizarrely, governments too aspire sometimes to be learning ecosystems. Maybe it is unnatural for bureaucracies, but some aspire. What's striking about all of those levels, from the 15-year-old in perhaps an industrial area of northern England, through to social entrepreneurs or policymakers, is that the learning ecosystems, when they work well, I think have 5 very common characteristics, all of which are difficult. The first is continually scanning the world for the most useful, most relevant knowledge. And that may come from anywhere, certainly doesn't usually come from the traditional sources, the most authoritative sources. And we try and build into all of these constant hunger for scanning. Secondly, all of them need constant questioning. That learning comes from then being very skeptical of what looks like a wonderful project, breaking it down, seeing which bits really work, asking what the evidence is. And I, all the time, hear wonderful stories of projects which, in fact, don't work very well. So very important to ask questions. Thirdly, in all of these cases, there's a sharing of tacit knowledge, craft knowledge, which you can't put on paper, but is actually really important to learning how to do a project if you're a teenager, running a school, doing policy. And that is often shared much more through face-to-face interaction, peer mentoring, peer support, than through formalized research and online. And then finally, there's creating the new. All of these environments these ecosystems have to innovate as well, create novel ideas, novel ways of working. And for all of these 4, what's striking is their best methods are quite different. The culture of scanning, the culture of questioning, the culture of craft knowledge, the culture of creativity are different and need different approaches. And that's why the 5th characteristic of the ones which work is they have pretty active orchestration. Learning ecosystems are not wholly organic. They require orchestration. They require a lot of inputs of energy and labor. And one of the great lessons of open systems in the last 5 or 10 years, of crowdsourcing, open innovation of all kinds, is they work best when they are both very open, but also very directed, very guided. And there's a hybrid quality to the ones which work, which is quite different from the sort of cliches about the wisdom of crowds and so on. And this is perhaps the craft knowledge of learning ecosystems, which we're all trying to learn.
Thank you, Jeff. Gwang-Jo.
Thank you, Tony. Good morning, everybody. I'm Gwang-Jo Kim. I'm director of UNESCO office in Bangkok, which is UNESCO's Asia-Pacific Regional Bureau for Education. UNESCO Bangkok covers 47 member states in Asia-Pacific. Prior to joining UNESCO, I worked for the government of Korea for almost 30 years. So I'm coming from policy background. So speaking about learning ecosystem, I'm looking at this issue from a policy angle and also from our member states' perspective. Traditionally, we talk a lot about the transformation of education or education reform. So I like this term ecosystem in the first place because it gives us a space to rethink how education should be delivered, how learning should occur. One obvious thing from this discourse is that learning should not occur only in schools, only at a certain period of time. It has to expand outside the school. It has to occur throughout one's life, so-called lifelong learning. Having said that, to my view, this learning ecosystem with two keywords. First of all, learning. In my view, learning, we need to revisit the concept of learning. In other words, while in many systems in the world, to my knowledge, including the countries that we serve in Asia Pacific, they always talk about literacy, life skills, numeracy, math, etc. Indeed, if you look at the international exercise like PISA and TIMSS, they look into this, what we call cognitive dimension of learning. We all understand this is critical for individuals to countries to thrive and to make progress economically and socially. But is it all that we are trying to achieve through learning? Perhaps not. There has to be some other elements when we speak about learning. So I find in our organization, UNESCO, we define learning having 4 pillars. The first pillar of these 4 would be obviously learning to know, and then learning to do, and learning to be, and perhaps more importantly, learning to live together. In my humble opinion, this 4th pillar of so-called 4 pillars of learning is not stressed enough, although we all agree the importance of this dimension. If you think about the conflicts, if you think about issues that transcend natural boundaries, like climate change, diseases, you name it, environment challenges, for all these problems of challenges, we all need to work together. For that, I think learning should be able to address this other dimension of learning. Unfortunately, this dimension is not stressed or emphasized enough in national policy, at international assessment. Having said that, the question is how best we can deliver this, the holistic dimension of learning through ecosystem, what we might call ecosystem, which might include, as Tony said it very nicely in the beginning, which include both formal and non-formal, perhaps informal training and education. So in my view, altogether, learning ecosystem could mean a system where all the kind of learning elements are effectively delivered through both formal and non-formal, plus informal system. So can you find an example from our region? I don't find such a wonderful system as of yet. Perhaps if we talk about a certain dimension of learning, namely cognitive dimension, we do see some countries in our region. We talk about a Singaporean case over the last 2 days. So as you know, Singapore is a country where they are doing very well economically, socially, and educationally, and on all indicators. But this country is not without challenge when it comes to delivering this fourth dimension of learning to live together, for instance, teamwork, entrepreneurship, being critical, etc., etc. And that Singaporean authorities, to my knowledge, they recognize the importance of this dimensional learning. I think they are currently pushing themselves very hard, and they are part of a so-called 21st Century Skill initiative. So with this initial thought, I have two questions in mind. One is, so if we believe in the desirable learning ecosystem, what is the role for each of us, especially for the state, for the government of all kinds, at the national level, at the national level, the role of state, and also what this learning ecosystem should mean for people who live in a remote village, who are in a way excluded from mainstream ecosystem. We talk a lot about cloud sourcing, massive open online courses, and so on and so forth. But still, all these are still luxury in many parts of Asia, Asian society. So the question is, how can we reach this unreached population in Asia Pacific and beyond? And should they be at the end of receiving all the learning contents? Perhaps not. They may have something to contribute. So I'm just throwing two questions. What this learning ecosystem mean to the underprivileged community? And for that, what should be the role of the state? Thank you.
Thank you. I actually want to return to that notion of what the role of the state is in just a second. But Francois, could you give us your thoughts?
So thank you. I'm Francois. I'm working in Paris. I'm an evolutionist, and I therefore have a bio-inspired version of ecosystems. And we work on ecosystems that are bacterial ecosystems, and bacteria are able to cooperate, exchange information on how to cooperate, and cooperate on how to exchange information. And they do this without any top-down monitoring from any institutions or state. And they seem to be doing this very well for billions of years, and they've refined the tools that allow them to do this. And so for me, an innovative learning ecosystem is an ecosystem of learning where every learner's learning is a contribution, not only to himself, but to the community. And so everyone in the community can learn more easily. And even better, the whole community is improving the way the next generation is going to learn. Okay, every new learner. So the tools for learning are improving constantly, not just the content. Okay, and I mean bacteria do the equivalent. I can go in details for those that are interested later. But so I don't have a teaching position, so I never had to teach, and I just try to help students and catalyze their learning and their community for them to be innovative, for them to collaborate, for them to exchange information, and to improve always what they do. Okay. I became a social entrepreneur thanks to Ashoka, as they made me realize that this was maybe an important contribution for ever more people. And so instead of just thinking about the local students that I could help, I started to think about how can we extend these notions to a wider dimensions. So I ended up writing a report for OECD on the future of education and the role of creativity in a world where everything is changing so fast, we just cannot predict in which environment or children will be having their jobs, their life, their loves, and etc. So we have to think about the situation. And progressively we created a space where students that want to reinvent learning, to reinvent teaching, to reinvent the way research is being done, to reinvent the way we can learn through doing research at the frontiers of knowledge, through the way we can teach through research like it's done in the best universities, and make this accessible to everyone that is connected on the planet. And so we are also trying to think about what are the best tools that can be developed. And I'll give one example of how to extend this ecosystem. And I think you mentioned going local to global, but we also have to think about how do you go global to local again. Okay, that's the only way everybody ends up benefiting. So local to global. So it's our group trying to think how we can network with other students all over the world, and how can we literally hack something that everybody uses for knowledge access, which is Wikipedia. Okay, and how can we improve Wikipedia? Because Wikipedia is, you have everything we are supposed to know, but it's not necessarily accessible, and not just because of digital tools. Sometimes you arrive to a page and you just don't understand a single word in that page. Go to the Proton page. If you understand it, you've got a diploma in physics. And that's the problem. So we have to make knowledge accessible to everyone, and so we have to make things that would be understandable by a 6-year-old. And actually, there are dictionaries for 6-year-old. So why not a Wikipedia for 6-year-old? Okay? And then we have to create tracks. If you want to go from a 6-year-old level of, say, proton or a genetic disease, how do you go progressively to ever better? Okay? So we have to create tools that allow to follow some paths, which are the optimal paths. As ants, for instance, when they explore nature, they explore paths, and one find a shorter path, and then she leaves a trail, and then others follow, and then the collective intelligence of the ants can explore better and exploit better the environment. So can we do something somewhat bio-inspired on Wikipedia? I think we can, because we have all the tools. We just have to adapt them. And then, this can be geolocalized. Okay? And because this is geolocalized, then you will know that in your local community, there is someone that is an expert in that genetic disease. And the day you find out that, your children have this genetic mutation, you may want to contact them and collaborate with them. And actually, there is another Ashoka fellow that did something like this. She discovered that 2 of her children had the same genetic disease, and she had no scientific background. And today she has 60 scientific publications on the subject. She became the world expert on the subject because she managed to connect not only the local ecosystem, but to the global ecosystem, and motivate others to join her in her quest of solving her children's problem. Okay? So that's a collective ecosystem that is learning and that is contributing to push the frontiers of knowledge and creating tools that will allow the next mother with similar problems to do it even more easy.
Interesting. Thank you. I'm going to turn to the audience in just a minute, but I actually want to pose one further question to the panel before we do. It actually touches on something, Jeff, you mentioned, as well as Gwang-Jo, this notion that learning ecosystems need to be organized, that they aren't necessarily self-organizing entities. So I'd like to pose to the panel the question of who organizes learning ecosystems for students? And what is the role, for example, of government in somehow being a part of the creation or sustaining of learning ecosystems? So on the issue of schools, I wonder if you had a thought, Michelle or Jeff, go ahead. You want to start?
Yeah, you talk about students, so immediately everyone thinks about the school as being the place where you bring learning together, and I do think that is the case. I think teachers do have a new role to play. We hear sage on the stage, guide on the side, mentor in the centre, facilitator. We have all these metaphors for what a teacher is, and I think today the metaphor is curator, curator of the learning environment. If you think about the museum, where the museum curator will put out selected artifacts with a little bit of information about them in some logical progression to help the students make sense of what's there. And it's then up to the learner to develop and find out more, like your mother going out and finding more. Something grabs your attention, grabs your interest, and you develop your learning through the things that grab your interest. You go to the archives. The internet is the archives. You go elsewhere, you go and talk to people, you find communities. But what the teacher has done is curating that and helping the learners to make sense of all the information, the myriad of information that's out there. And, we have so much stuff. And how does any learner make sense? And we do need more knowledgeable others to support the learners. And of course, other learners working with them. But that curation idea, I think, is something we need to grasp and think about.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Francois and then Jeff.
So I think, governments have a hard time following technologies and following students. So it's hard for them to predict what students would be doing and what technology will be doing. But what I think they can do is contribute to create a frame where students would be invited to think about these issues. And for instance, if a government decides to fund a PhD program that is dedicated to building tools for improving the technologies of learning, that will be a big progress. Okay? If you look at, most technology we're using today, even in a learning environment, have not been designed for learning. Okay? Most of them have been designed for many other reasons, and they end up being sold as well to schools or learners, okay, and their parents. And, making a real effort of developing technologies of learning, I will call them, Socratic technologies, okay, which is, emphasizing the Socratic method, the critical thinking, the questioning, the ability to collaborate and to creatively, collectively produce knowledge for oneself and for the collective.
Thanks. Jeff, and then Gwang-Jo.
Well, I certainly, having worked a lot in governments, wouldn't encourage governments to lead on running learning ecosystems. And one very striking point, when we were developing studio schools, we drew on examples from all over the world, from Paraguay, Brazil, India, but nearly always they were examples quite away from the gaze of government, where in a way they'd mobilized the whole community as teachers, learners, etc., without much involvement of the state. I think there are things governments can do, mainly not getting in the way through their assessment rules, their funding rules, their regulatory rules. Most controversially, I would say that for any school system to be able to do the things my fellow panelists have talked about, you have to make it possible to create brand new schools with a radically different ethos. And the fact that in many public systems it is almost impossible to create a new school with a different ethos guarantees these ideas don't come to fruition. And that is, I say, a controversial point. Within the school itself, as Michel said, there are very different models. In the studio schools, every pupil has a coach. The coach is the primary role, more primary even than the teacher, and they help the pupil orchestrate their learning ecosystem. But they don't do it on their own. Through the network, they are provided with a whole set of tools to help them do the curation job, because it's very hard to make it all up for yourself. And some of these are technical tools, but many of them are relatively non-technical. They are just methods of orchestrating the bringing together of resources, knowledge, people, and so on.
Thank you. Francois, you had a point.
Thank you, Tony. Perhaps I have to disagree with some of fellow panelists when we think about the role of government. It may be true in some societies or some countries, but in other societies, we still expect government to play a major role, if not the leading role. I say this because, number one, many schools will be irrelevant. You may think irrelevant, but you will recognize, compared to 20 years back, we still have schools in all countries in the world. Regardless of development, that's one thing, which means there is something that schools still deliver. And still, I would say, if we believe that schools are still important, I think the government has to play some role to make schools to become a more desirable learning ecosystem. I say this because based on our experience in Asia Pacific, some of the high-performing countries, I talked about Singaporean case, but they are not without any challenges. For instance, when it comes to learning, it's all about learning to perform well in tests, if I exaggerate a little bit. I would say some of these systems are very much driven by exam, and that's high-stake exams to get access to prestigious institutions, which will guarantee a better or decent job or lucrative profession later on. And of course, the government alone cannot change this whole incentive schemes. So what I would argue for the government is one thing that government can do is perhaps they can change the rule of game, and also the government can support the remote villages and communities where, as I said, where they don't have this luxurious technology. So the government can provide funding and support. And last but not least, when it comes to education and learning and teachers, the government, there's a great room for the government to do more about the teachers. Typically, teachers are not very well paid in many countries, unfortunately. But if you look at high-performing countries, teachers in Finland, for instance, in Singapore, in my country, Korea, Japan, they are very well paid and respected. And these are some of the things that the government can do. Thank you.
Thanks. So you had a point.
One of the important things government can do to free the technology evolution on one side and make it available to everyone, including in the most remote communities, is make sure this is developed in an open source model where the content is under Creative Commons license and so on. And that's true, I think, of any local government. It's even more true at the larger scale. So, it's more true at the European scale and the French scale, and it's even more true at the world scale. Okay? So I think, there is a very important message that governments should hear on this issue, and that's the only way we can reap the world benefits. And, furthermore, what has been proven scientifically, and I can again discuss this if you want, there is experiment that show that an open source of collaboration is much more creative and much more reactive and much more efficient, and ends up, providing much better result in the long run. So we need to incentivize this. It doesn't say there shouldn't be company involved. It doesn't say anything like this. Google and many others are using open source technologies, IBM and so on. Okay, so we can think of the right models, and that's where governments can think about the legal framework and the economic framework.
Thank you. So to the audience, other questions? I think we may have microphones. We had at the previous sessions, but perhaps we don't. So, oh, okay. So, right where you are, there's a person waving their hand. That will be a start. We'll stack a couple of two or three of these together, and then we'll have the panel respond. So, say who you are, and then your question.
I'm Caroline Medel Año-Nuevo. I work at UNESCO Institute for Lifelong Learning. First of all, I would like to say that this has really been a very fascinating first round of presentations, because it makes us think of different perspectives. I particularly enjoy the biological perspective on learning, but I think we need to have some basic assumptions, and sometimes in the use of the terms we are mixing things. I think first of all we need to accept that education is a public good, and therefore as a public good, it is the governments who should make sure that the right to education is fulfilled, is guaranteed. So I think now there's a lot of discussion about public-private partnerships, but I think the onus for providing education still needs to be in the governments, except that, of course, we know that with deficits, budgets, that's a big challenge. I think the second point is when we talk about learning in a context of providing public good. But then when we say what is a learning society, I think, as I agree with my colleague, Gwang-Jo, that in fact, at the moment in this meeting, we're talking about educating the child. Most of the presentations have really talked about educating the child. But if we talk about learning societies, it means all of us learning together. And maybe this is one tension, because it's like, yes, we need to focus on providing the public good for the child, but in fact, in providing this public good, we also need to make sure that all of us are learning. And I think that is the challenge when we say learning societies. At what level are we talking about learning societies? Are we talking about the learning communities? Are we talking about learning nations? Are we talking about learning world? And this brings me to my last point about, if you look at the problems of the world today, we have not, of course, we just brushed on this, the question of inequality. We are living in a highly unequal world. We have presenters who are talking about technology and all this, but we know that in vast majorities of the country, children have no even homes, have no food, have no access to electricity. So how do we cope with this? We are living in a highly conflictual world. Today you see in the TV that there are strikes now in Gaza, and there's all these problems. So how do we confront this when we talk about learning societies? We are living in a world where people are getting ill, and how do we confront this? So I think for us, when we say learning societies, forging new links, this means learning societies, governments need to learn so that they are able to put in place more creative societies and schools. But the question is, how do we make sure that we are all responsible, but at the same time, not forgetting that the main responsibility is really with the government? Thank you.
Thanks. We'll hold that thought. What I heard you were saying is that there's an issue of sort of how do we think of learning societies in terms of who learns as well as for the purpose of learning. what exactly do we want our learning societies to learn about and do with that learning. So we'll come back to that in just a second. One or two more before we go forward. There's a person right here. If you have the mic, who has the? Oh, yeah, right there. That'd be great.
Hello, I'm Jakob Krau. I'm from Lego Education, and I have a question primarily to Dr. Kim, because one of the things when we talk about the role of government, you represent a region where there is a vast ecosystem outside of formal education, lots of learning centers that are present in countries like Korea, China, Japan. So my question is whether that ecosystem is surfacing in a country like Korea, where you're from, because of the dysfunctional educational system where parents don't entrust the public schooling to deliver education and therefore send them to the outside providers of education, or whether it is something that the government is encouraging and seeing as a supplement to formal education.
Great. Thank you. That'll be for you, Gwang-Jo, but just one more. In the back, hand is up there. Then I'll come over here. I'm sorry if I'm missing you all, but you'll get the next round. How about? Go ahead.
السلام عليكم. اسمحوا لي راح أتحدث بالعربية. أنا فهمي المشايخي ناشط اجتماعي في دول مجلس التعاون الخليجي من قطر. من خلال هذا
I'm an activist in a organization working here in Qatar. Now, in this discussion, we heard about a lot of experiences that met with success, and these experiences can be adapted for certain environments, but not necessarily for others. I ask UNESCO, because it's an international organization, to make a report on all these experiences, experiments, and that they put it on the internet so that everyone may be able to learn from them and see what is adapted to them. Because sometimes we hear about certain experiences or experiments that met with success. They're imposed in certain countries while they're not necessarily adapted for that country. So I would request UNESCO to actually make a list of all these experiments, experiences, filter them, put them on the internet, and put a kind of a guide book to say how they can be applied, for which environment they are actually adapted. You know, when we talk about education, education is something so complex. It's a system that actually includes so many elements. So when you said that it's not only the business of the governments, but everybody's business in fighting extremism, for example, fundamentalism, and we therefore, as I said, request UNESCO to do this work so that we may be able to use it and benefit from it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll ask my colleagues then to take those in any order they'd like, but Francois, you look like you're ready to speak, and then we have one for Gwang-Jo directly.
I mean, what you said is true for UNESCO, but I think, UNESCO has limited means and limited time to take those challenges. I think if you would invite the collective intelligence of all those that care about education, and especially, if PhD programs, master program, where students are learning about new ways of learning, where systematically assessing what's happening in their country, what's happening in the neighboring country, comparing if what's being done elsewhere would be adapted to them. Maybe they try to implement it, and then they test it on a small scale, and then they give you a report. I think that would be a much more interesting feedback to your question than a top-down centralized view. It doesn't say UNESCO should not at some stage issue a report, but if they issue a report once a year, it's going to be the best they could do, I'm pretty sure. Okay? Whereas you could get something, daily there is new initiatives that came out and that are being reported. So I think it would be much more interesting to have the whole ecosystem learning about the best practices and sharing about them.
Thank you. Gwang-Jo.
Thank you, Francois. You made my job easier. You answered part of my answer. But thank you very much for your proposal or suggestion. But if you visit our website, we already have many materials online from UNESCO Institute of Lifelong Learning and our UNESCO office in Bangkok, etc. But in my view, we will certainly do that. We will certainly make our resources more available. And first of all, we collect good practices from our member states and analyze and make them available to everybody. But before, this may not be sufficient. You have to look for other sources of information. And in that regard, I think this kind of gathering is very, very meaningful. I really appreciate the organizer for that matter, because the online or virtual communication may not be sufficient. So we need to have this face-to-face dialogue from time to time to get to learn and from each other. Going back to the question from gentleman from Lego, I thank you very much for your wonderful question. If I understood you correctly, yes, it is very true in these countries, including my own country, Korea, Japan, China. We have lots of learning centers. But if you look at what these are, actually the majority of the learning centers are actually some kind of cram schools or private tutoring institutes. Again, because in these countries, the education is very much driven by the exams, high-stake exams. So what they do normally is to prepare students, learners, to perform better in all kinds of tests. It's not just college entrance exams. In China these days, they have all kinds of prep schools. Unfortunately, this is the reality. But on the other hand, many countries in Asia Pacific have what we call community learning centers, where they want to deliver all kinds of learning to those who miss out the first chance education opportunity and community people, etc. So in our host country, Thailand alone, there are almost 10,000 community learning centers in Vietnam and many other countries. So we should distinguish this kind of learning centers from the first type of learning centers. So then why it is happening in this country, especially in Korea? Yes, it is true that there's a great deal of mistrust towards public education system. It could mean two things in my view. One is the schools are not doing enough in terms of delivering these learning outcomes. But on the other hand, the parents and the Korean and Japanese, Chinese parents have high expectation in terms of what they want to get from education and learning system. Traditionally, in this country, there is a strong tradition and cultural heritage where learning and learn people highly respected and regarded. I think it has a lot to do with this traditional culture in the one hand, but in my personal view, this satisfaction along with high expectation in a way has been the driving force behind all this achievement over the years. Thank you.
Thank you. Michelle, do you have a comment on this?
Yes, I mean, the question about education being a public good, yeah, absolutely it is. But the problem is it's also a political good. And it's the politicization of education that I think is often the problem, because it's what wins and loses elections. So I think we are persuaded by parents who come from a system that the people with the best voice, the people who have been success of a system that has failed so many, and therefore it's very difficult to make those changes because it's such a political animal, because it is in the public sphere. And I also think that governments don't learn from these extreme situations. We commissioned Charlie Leadbeater to write a paper called Learning from the Extremes, and that shows how you can get real innovation, disruptive innovation, from non-government-led education systems. And yet governments don't look at those, they don't want to know what they can learn from those, because it's quite difficult. It's very difficult to make those changes. And it's a very bold government that's going to do it. So I think that's one of the big issues. And if you look at high-performance learning systems where teachers are valued, you don't get, in not all cases, but in some cases, you don't get this situation. And then just want to really pick up very quickly on the idea of peace and where peace comes from. And peace absolutely comes from the children. It has to come from the children. They are going to be the arbiters of peace in the future. And we have to start now by teaching global understanding and acceptance. And it's so crucial. And it isn't really embedded in the curriculum. And it has to be.
Thanks, Michelle. Jeff, you have a comment.
Yeah, first of all, maybe even to disagree with Michelle, if I can. So I think education is a public good. It's a very important public good, but it's also a private good. If I learn Arabic poetry or you do tennis courses, that's not obvious that the state should pay for that, because most of the benefit will go to you. And I think this is really important for many of aspects of this conversation. And let's take the lifelong learning one you raised. Andreas Schleicher showed these amazing graphs yesterday, that as we grow old, our skills deteriorate. The older we are, the dumber we get, he seemed to be saying. There are some countries which are exceptions, Sweden, Finland in particular. And it's not hard to imagine a society where there was a very different pattern and where learning was embedded in the workplace, in the community, in the family, and it was automatic that if you were 40 or 50 or 60, you would spend quite a lot of your year learning. But in public budgets, only a tiny fraction of education goes to the years after 21, despite all the rhetoric over many decades. Now, the one place where I think this is changing is interesting around health, where in some ways health is being rethought as a learning system, partly because of the importance of long-term chronic diseases in the rich north, and partly because of the pressures of public health in the south. And that is leading to the design of health systems which don't just cure diseases, but teach the citizen to self-manage their condition, to help their family. Some of this is happening with technologies. There are 10,000 health apps now. Nearly all of them are bad, but it's a start. Some of them will become good. And we have very interesting innovation around health learning systems using the mobile phone, sometimes using computing, but nearly all of it's coming from places like East Africa and India and South Africa, not from Europe or Korea or the USA. And that's partly because the vested interest, the power structures in health in the rich north find this very uncomfortable, because turning health into a learning ecosystem, to use our language, actually changes power structures fundamentally. But that's the one space where I think the lifelong learning vision is really beginning to happen. Otherwise, in most places, it's all words.
Francois, and then I want to ask another question.
So on the role of government, there is one more point that you've been raising, which is, there should be laws for investing in continuous lifelong learning, and they should be on funding research in the areas where government thinks it's important. And when we heard yesterday the OECD telling us that, there is 15 times less research on education than there is in health, even though the GDP of both is about the same. And I think, in 19th century, health made big progresses. We've tripled life expectancy. But now there is diminishing return of the $500 billion we invest in medicine, research. We have only 25 new drugs, okay? So that's $20 billion per drug on average. Okay, I think with much less than this, you could make big investment, big progresses with smaller investment to improve the educational system. Okay, and I think, among the people that are going to need continuous training, lifelong learning, teachers. Okay, teachers have been trained 10, 20, 30 years ago in a different world, and they are going to train children that are, going to work for 60 years. Or more, okay? So they have to prepare kids for an environment they've not known and that nobody has known and that nobody can predict. So they have to learn continuously and be doing research on what this means. So there has to be investment in these things, and that's the only way. And I think if this is investment are shared publicly, and again, creating public good and making all this available to everyone, then societies can progress. Otherwise, you will get those that will get the best education because they'll get the best tools, and the others will remain always behind. Okay? And so if we want to be more equal, it has to be all open access again.
Gwang-Jo, you have the last word on this segment, and then we'll go.
Yeah, I'll be very brief. Thank you, Tony. Well, health and education is a very difficult issue. It would be unfair for education to be compared with their health counterpart, for a number of reasons. Firstly, in health, you can have this randomized experimentation, and you can get evidence, and that can be quickly disseminated and shared by peers. That's one thing.
Why can't you in education?
Why can't education? Good question. In education, you know that we know from economists that education pays off in the long run. I'm speaking of the rate of return, but we don't know clearly is what kind of intervention, pedagogy, lead to quality learning outcome. As we can debate about this for hours, but this is something it has been very difficult for education research to prove. But in health, you can get results rather immediately, if not instantly. Whereas education, it takes time to get to see the results, as we all know. That's one thing. One more point about this adult learning, as Geoff brought up. This is still another area that government can do through a combination of policies, tax policy, financing, etc. For instance, if governments give a tax break to employees who encourage their employees to get advanced training in certain areas, and many employers do that, but the incentive has to be provided through government. So adult learning is something that we also need to consider when we speak about learning ecosystem. Thank you.
All right, on this one point, though, about whether or not we can have more rapid information coming about education. Jeff, did you have a point on that? And Francois?
I think you can do randomized controlled trials in education. Even more important, though, much of the most useful knowledge in health has come from taking long cohort studies, looking at diet and exercise and what happens to your health over 10, 20, 30 years. There's very little comparable in education. The most useful features of this kind of research is not just to tell you what works, and in health it usually takes you quite a lot of research before you know what works, but also what doesn't work. And my guess is in education there's a lot of apparently good practice which doesn't work. I mean, one very famous example you may know from the US is sending reformed criminals into schools to talk to children to persuade them not to become criminals, which sounds really sensible. It's one of many programs which have been popular, scaled, and then when they were studied with real rigor, turned out not only not to stop children becoming criminals, they actually made more children into criminals than if they hadn't had these classes. This is why research is so important, and it has to be skeptical and rigorous and willing to say no. This doesn't work, and this is all too rare in education.
Francois.
And on this feedback loop, okay, I mean, I'm a biomedical researcher, okay. In biomedical research, it might take 10 to 20 years, and if you find a side effect 20 years later, I mean, so it's the same problem in education. There might be side effects, and we might know only very late, as you've just been describing, Jeff. But I think there is something new there, okay, that is easier to do actually with learning than with health, okay, which is with digital learning, you can record every stage of the learning, okay? Like in the games, I mean, the game designers, I mean, a game is a place where you're learning to solve challenges, okay? And within the games, they've been evolving the game dynamics so to make the learning easier and the challenges ever more exciting and so on, okay? Why can't we use the exact same method? Actually, it's being done. Okay, so learning analytics is a big movement that big companies like Google and game companies have introduced, and it's starting to be used within education framework. And when you have 100,000 students following the exact same course online, okay, you can, for instance, randomly give a small variant between the two and assess the impact of this variation. You can discover that 2% of your students are failing this one exercise, and then you can make something that is tailored to their problem. Okay, and so this can happen much faster because now we have rapid feedback, and this is easier to measure the feedback of did you learn how to solve this equation than are you going to live 2 years longer 50 years from now?
Okay. Okay, no, we're going to have another question. And then I'm going to turn to the audience again. I actually want to pick up on the notion that you mentioned about digital technologies. It appears as though that the use of digital technologies is central to the sort of transformational potential of learning ecosystems. And I want to first ask the panel, first of all, is that true? Is this whole notion sort of based on or require digital technology? And to the extent that it is, I want to sort of come back to the point that was raised earlier about is there then a potential for there then to be a digital divide between individuals or countries or parts of societies where this sort of reliance or necessity of digital technology could create a new gap between the haves and have-nots? So on the role of technology and kind of its potential for either in a sort of good or evil, as it were. Francois.
So I've got a good friend that is also an Ashoka Fellow from India, and he's developed games for 10 years old cell phones, okay, that are currently available in any rural Indian or African villages, okay, and that are games that will allow you, that are free because he talked with the mobile companies, and he make them accessible to 50 million people today, okay, and those games are games that will help you to learn about your own health. Okay, health preventions for HIV, for malaria, helping women to follow their pregnancy, what are the different stages, where should they be taking care, and so on. Okay, so and he managed to do that because some of the technology, even a 10-year-old technology, can be super useful. Okay, so it's not necessarily the latest gadget that's big companies are trying to sell you that's going to be life-saving or changing your learning experience. Okay? And that's especially true if we're able to design technologies that, again, because they're open and the content are open, will be accessible to everyone. So I think the gap will be a real problem if we let companies lock the access to technologies, lock the access to knowledge. And then there will be a real problem. But if you are playing open, I think this should not be an issue over the long run. Why? Because there is an exponentially decreasing cost of computing power and of all sorts of technology. Okay? For instance, it costs 1 million-fold less to sequence a genome than 8 years ago. Okay? And tomorrow it will cost nothing. You can sequence a genome on a USB key. You can turn your cell phone into a microscope. You can turn it into a scientific lab. A cell phone, even a 10-year-old cell phone, has more computing power than the NASA used to go to the moon. Okay, so if you want to, you could go to the moon. Okay, you just have to decide which moon you want to land in. Okay, and which team you're going to organize to be able to get there.
Thank you, Michelle. You've got a comment coming.
Well, on the digital technologies, what I think it's done, it's made access to learning easier because of the multimodal representations. Scientific understanding, mathematical understanding can be increased because you can make things dynamic, you can make them visible. The digital microscope you just talked about. If you go back to when you were at school and you're looking down the microscope and they say, "Can you see the black spot?" and you can't see the black spot. Whereas a digital microscope, you can share it with everybody. You can discuss it. You can talk about it. You can collaborate. You can learn. Your learning becomes more authentic because you've got access to authentic data. You don't have to have the data that's in the textbook. You can actually, explore things. I mean, there's so much you can do with digital technologies. Inequality is going to exist, and there are, mobile phones are prevalent across the world, and much more so than the internet. And I do believe that mobile technologies are really going to help reduce inequities. And as the internet becomes more pervasive, then we will see the change, but it will take time.
Jeff?
Well, I certainly think digital technologies will transform education, and it's a big problem if you don't have access to it. Any child who really is cut off will suffer as a result. And the effects will be, I think, in 3 areas. One is the analytics, the feedback, the assessment, and I think this may become much more important than we guess even now. In terms of transforming the practice of education when you have constant real-time feedback on how well the child is doing. The second area is, in a way, the revolutionizing of existing learning of maths and science and geography. But the third is, I think, an interesting one, which is a particular focus for my organization, which is how do we get children becoming not just users of digital tools, but makers of games, makers of apps, makers of programs, using Arduino to make robots. And my guess is this will turn out to be much more important and often empowering for children than just learning good e-learning stuff. And a lot of the e-learning stuff, I think, now is not that great. Final point, if you're interested, later today we are publishing on the Nesta website a research study trying to take stock of the current state of global knowledge of what actually works of the use of digital technology in education. It's looked at 2,500 different projects and technologies. The conclusions in some ways are very obvious ones, but they perhaps need repeating, that nearly always you only get the effect of the technology if you also change the learning practice, you also change the way the teachers work, and change the context. Just parachuting technologies into any situation is almost certain to fail. But I'd be very interested in any of your feedback on our report.
Thank you. Michelle, and then I'm going to go to the audience.
Yeah, just want to come back quickly on the issue of creation. I absolutely 100% agree with Jeff that is crucial, but it's not just about apps development. It's so much more. It's about creating your learning in new ways. Documentary filmmaking instead of writing essays. Creating animations, creating games, and we should be looking at assessment in new ways because students can create so much with this technology, and we should be using it in teaching because students as creators of resources for other students can sometimes be a lot better than the stuff that we create as teachers. So we've got to use it, we've got to value it and make sense of it.
Thank you. I have a colleague over here. I missed this group here, so right here first, and then I'm going to come over here. But you have his hand up here. Yeah. Right. I think I'll.
Thank you very much, Jean-Éric Aubert, former World Bank head of program and to OECD also in the past. I have some difficulty with the fact that whatever you take, the level of individuals, there is increasing inequality in the world, except in a few, I would say, developing countries. Secondly, if you take at the level of nations, when they are on a decline trajectories, they go into decline. It's very difficult to change the trajectory of nations. And when it happens, it's generally a good chance, question of serendipity. When you go look at the world, you see that we are going, for instance, into big problem with climate change, that type of things. And it's very difficult to change also the trajectory of the global world. So in other words, there is no real collective learning for what matters. So my question is, can you create, I would say, a condition in which there would be a real collective learning and ecosystem at the different levels, individual, community, nations, possibly the global world, and can you do something which could be, I would say, a real breakthrough in the thinking and the approach?
Thank you very much. I'm Andrew Lehman from the Durban Chamber of Commerce and Industry, and I'm interested in the issue of evaluation. We had a disaster in South Africa with a new approach, which lost public confidence very quickly, and then everybody retreated to the traditional, because the traditional seemed to work better. Now, as I understand it, in both the United States and the UK over the years, quite a number of new innovations have been tried and shown not to be successful. So I want to ask Jeff about the studio schools. At what point will you be able to determine whether this has been successful or not, and against what criteria will the success be measured? Michelle talked about current scholars being the arbiters of future peace. Does that mean if we don't have a world war in 25 years that the education system has been good? And if we do have a world war, does it mean that the system has failed? I'm not sure if we're paying sufficient attention as to the criteria against which we assess whether our system's successful or not.
Thank you. I'm going to go with those two questions to begin with because I think we have a lot of meaty possibilities there. So on the first one, or either one, Francois, you have your mic up, and then Jeff, I know you want to respond to what was asked about your assessment issue.
I mean, my gut feeling about your question, which I think is very important, is that the more open data we have, the more easy it's going to be for everyone to contribute to this collective intelligence. Okay? If this data belongs to company, you know, there's many companies that know more about you than yourself. Okay? I mean, Google, to take an example, or Facebook, or whatever. Okay? And you know, there's many governments that know things about education systems, but don't want to share it with the public because they are afraid of the public reaction to the reality, which is that the system is very unequal within countries. Okay? And, you know, France is one example that we can discuss more as French. But, I mean, that's true, I guess, in many places. So I think the open data movement is absolutely essential because then, you know, if you get open data and you allow everyone to own, you know, you want to know yourself. That's a Socratic method. You want to know yourself as individual, you want to know yourself as collective, as nations, as a globe. Okay? And if there is only a few people that know, okay, knowledge is power, and power is money. And if there is discrepancy in the access to knowledge, then there will be discrepancy in the access to income and the access to health and the access to education and the access to everything. Okay? So I think the more open, the more free the information, and the more people, the more eyeballs can come to check that, you know, there was no corruption here and that, you know, we've imported as fast as possible the best practices coming from somewhere else, the faster it will be. Okay? I mean, we created bureaucracy in a time where, and elections in times where it was a very slow process to have information from one part of the country to the other part of the country. Okay? And so you had to rely on, you know, hierarchical decision-making processes. And we created, you know, flow of information that are, you know, going upward, and then decision-making is happening on the top. And then we have a very slow process of reaction because of this. Okay? If we have, you know, open data where everybody can react locally, you take, you know, learning analytics. Should learning analytics be held by, you know, big companies controlling your learning, big brother type? Should it be controlled by the university? Should it be controlled by the teacher? Or by the learner? Or by everybody? Okay? And I think, you know, the learner can react the fastest. You know, if he's failed, he doesn't want to fail, he's going to try to do something else, if he has a proper feedback. Okay? The teacher may want to have a slower feedback, but that will be relevant for the whole class. Okay? And the university might want to have a slower feedback, but that will be relevant for the whole classes of all the teachers of all the students that they are taking care of. Okay? And the government might, you know, take a slower feedback, but, you know, that will have a bigger impact. Okay? So, you know, different institutions and different individuals have different feedback rate and different impact. Okay? So there is, if you want to maximize the feedback and the efficiency, you have to make it freely available for all the actors, all the stakeholders of this. And then they are not passive consumer or whatever. They are, you know, active citizens trying to improve their life and the life of their peers and the life of their communities and the life of the planet.
Thank you. Jeff, you want to come in on this? And then
yeah, just two brief points. So first of all, on studio schools, we wanted the assessment criteria to be things like motivation, resilience, teamwork, and those were at the heart of the design. In practice in our system, the only measure which was taken seriously was exam results. Luckily, the field trials achieved incredible exam results, which persuaded the government to get behind the model, and they've kept on getting very good exam results. But the assessment criteria are not the desirable ones. We're now designing a randomized control trial with Oxford University, which will try and look at both the formal academic and these other non-cognitive results and really test against control groups. But yours is a very good question. As is, I think, the other one, which is a topic of great interest to me. How do we actually achieve collective intelligence for the individual, the organization, the nation? I think overall our systems of orchestration of knowledge are incredibly poor globally, so there is very little learning, and therefore people repeat lots of unnecessary mistakes. If you think of collective intelligence, though, as a hierarchy, at the bottom is data, information, knowledge, judgment, wisdom. We have very powerful tools at the bottom for data, but almost no advance at all in judgment, let alone wisdom. And in a way, the risk of the internet era is that it is so strong on data, it may even weaken our powers of judgment and wisdom. I happen not to believe that nations face inevitable declining trajectories, And all over the world, including this region, China, India, we have many examples of nations turning themselves around. But that's a complex topic which cannot be understood just through data analytics. It requires very different modes of collective intelligence. And for me, the great challenge for the organizations you've worked in, like OECD, is how can they really leap ahead in terms of their ability to orchestrate all of these different levels of intelligence and make it useful.
Gwang-Jo.
Yes, I have a quick thoughts. Yes. First of all, regarding the declining or decaying trajectory, I don't necessarily agree with your points. There are some other cases where it hasn't been exponential growth, but that there are countries which prove that things can be achieved in a rather short time period, including my own country. Then the question of this breakthrough and why hasn't there been collective learning to address this, our global climate change and other global scale issues? I agree with you. I think one of the reasons, as far as I could see, is if you look at the national system or institution of learning, education, training, there hasn't been enough emphasis on the other side of learning. I'm talking about learning to live together, things that cannot be easily observed and therefore measured, but there are things that are very important for us to, as human beings, to live together. Take, for example, countries are obsessed with this thing called competitiveness. That is why OECD PISA has been so popular. In my coming from policy background, every time you're right, the PISA results, they are made available. Policymakers become nervous. First, they look at their national average, how they fare with other countries, and the dispersion, etc. It is very true, but very few countries use that as an opportunity to think beyond what PISA can tell us. So what I'm arguing is there has to be stress on this other dimensional learning to teach kids to learn to live together, to look beyond their own individual country or society, to tackle these transnational issues. Right now, if you look at the leaders from around the world, I'm sorry to say this, we talk a lot about collaboration, but in reality, we don't see very many concrete actions and follow-ups. That's one thing. The last point about the criteria for success, I think, in my view, education is a very complex process. One can compare this with education, but I don't think this contemporary methodology can tackle all this intricacy of educational or learning process, which doesn't mean that we don't need any feedback loop, but we need to be modest in terms of interpreting what data can tell us, and which means that we all need to look at what we can achieve through education and learning process in our given situation. Thank you.
Francois.
So, Aristotle already long time ago said that there were three dimensions of knowledge. Episteme, that became science, techne, that became technology, and phronesis, which everybody has forgotten. Okay? And phronesis was about the ethics of action. Okay? So we have to learn this at the individual level and at the collective level. Okay? And especially decision makers should understand this. Okay? And we are all decision makers at our own scales. But I think this is very important. And it's very hard to teach what wisdom should be. But you could teach for wisdom or for ethics or for developing a critical thinking about this issue and put into consideration not only your selfish short-term interest, but also your long-term interest that might still be selfish, but also the collective interest, okay? And also not only the local implications of what you're doing and of your actions, but also the global implications of your action. Okay, you may want to drive to go to have pleasure, but if everybody does this, then we have global warming and all sorts of problems. So I think we need to take this into account. T.S. Eliot said, a few years ago, decades ago now, where is the wisdom we have lost in knowledge? Where is the knowledge we have lost in information? And I agree with Jeff. Today you would say, where is the information we've lost in data? Okay, and we have to teach the kids how to go from the data to the information, from the information to the knowledge, from the knowledge to the judgment, and from the judgment to the ethics, if not wisdom, okay? And how do we put this, okay? So, PISA is an interesting tool, but it's measuring only a few parameters, okay? It's not measuring how to live together. It's not measuring if you learn how to be. It doesn't tell you, about your own emotions and how to handle them. It doesn't tell you how to handle the others. We had an interesting learner asking yesterday exactly for this. Why don't we learn about our emotions? Why don't we learn about these things earlier? Why do we have to learn so many maths when the computers are better than we are at maths anyway? Okay, why can't we learn about things that computers cannot do? Computers will never tell you what's ethical. They will never tell you what's an emotion. Okay, so we have to try to develop what's truly human. Okay, Garry Kasparov, world chess champion, first one to be defeated by a computer. He organized what he called advanced chess. What is advanced chess? Advanced chess is man and machine together are better than the machine alone that is better than man alone in that dimension. Okay? So we have to develop this ability to know when you should rely on yourself, when you should rely on the machine, when you should try to get the best of both, when you should get the best of your individual intelligence, when you should get the best of the collective intelligence.
Thank you. Michelle, on this point, then I have one last question for the panel before I think we have to wrap up.
Yeah, just a quick one. I think we can learn a lot from informal learning about the collective wisdom and how and I'll take the example of my husband, who is a classic car enthusiast, and his engines are always going wrong. He can't work out why. He goes onto the forum, he posts his question. Within 20 minutes, he has 4 or 5 solutions that have been argued out by a group of people. He has no idea who they are. They could be the expert on the engine. They could have built the engine. It doesn't matter. You don't know who they are. It doesn't matter who they are. Everyone feels empowered. He comes up with 3 or 4 solutions. He will go and try them, and he feels obliged to come back and contribute his response. And that response is then used by the next person. So we can learn a lot from these informal collectives, which are self-organizing systems. And we've seen that in education. We've seen self-organizing systems in education that works, and the hole in the wall is a great example of that. Sugata Mitra's hole in the wall from India. So we can do it. There are ways of doing it, but we just haven't found a way to do it in a formal education society.
Thank you. I want to end with one question that perhaps I want you to bear in mind all we've talked about today and other things that are in the conference as well. But particularly thinking about kind of transforming education and how we might apply our notions of transformative education. Her Highness Sheikh Mosa announced yesterday the Educate a Child initiative that seeks to educate millions of refugee and other out-of-school children. If you were her investment advisor, what would you have her invest in to try to reach her goals? How would you actually think about what we've talked about today and think about what would be the best way in which we might tackle the notion of educating millions of children who aren't otherwise being educated now? I will ask any of you to start, but first with the microphone is Francois.
That's a tough challenge, but I think it's a very nice one and a beautiful one that the Sheikh decided to try to tackle. I don't think anyone has the answer, at least I don't. The way I would go for it is I would take, the Sheikh and WISE have selected WISE learners. I think I would select even more of them from even more different backgrounds. I would send them to these camps. And some of them might be designers, some of them might be teachers, some of them might be computer scientists, some of them might be technologists, some of them might be all sorts of things, social scientists, etc. And collectively, I will ask them to think together with the local communities how to co-construct solution. What is the rate limiting? Discuss with the children, discuss with their teachers, discuss with their parents, discuss with the people in charge of the camps, and try to co-construct a solution. Try to make it, test. It's probably not going to work optimally at the first trial. Optimize it in a regular way, okay? Until you get something that is considered satisfactory by most people locally, that you can assess it rigorously as possible, and then you go to the next camp and you say, okay, it's probably very different, yet there is probably common things. Mm-hmm. So maybe this solution could be applied. And then you go on, and then maybe you spread it to all the 60 million kids ultimately. But that's the sort of things I would be doing. I would not pretend anyone has a solution, and that, if you give me all the money with my solution, I'll be rich, and maybe something good will happen. Okay, because that's going to be the solution that some people will propose.
Right. Do you want to weigh in, Gwang-Jo?
Yeah,
I'm just going to come down the line here. Yeah.
Yes, just quickly, my advice would be, I'm sure she's doing already, to partner with other national and international entities. I'm speaking about the existing initiatives such as Education for All, or EFA, as part of Millennium Development Goal. We have only 3 years from now to the target year. We know that many countries are still struggling. Countries in my region, it's a matter of reaching the unreached 3 to 5% of the marginal population. So one thing that this initiative can do is to identify who they are, how we can convince the key decision makers, including the government, to speed up the process. Speeding up the process would require, first of all, this well-functioning feedback loop, and also, in other words, information and data, perhaps wisdom, and also funding and modal delivery mechanism, and so on and so forth. This requires holistic approach. This is something I would propose to work with other partners, national and international.
Great. Jeff, we have about a minute or so to go.
So very quickly, for any social project or any social innovation, you have to both generate what I call effective demand, someone willing to pay for it and able to pay for it, and effective supply, some way of ensuring it works. The effective supply, I'd agree with what's been said by the previous two speakers. Almost certainly it won't be a matter of just finding one thing and scaling it. It has to be a much more dynamic and adaptive process. But in fact, the key, I suspect, will be on the effective demand side. Here, we're talking essentially about a global public good. Here, I think it genuinely is a public good, but where there is not a financial, fiscal basis for paying for it. So I would argue a key issue is advocacy. And to me, the question is, can we find ways of linking global public goods which have value and using them to finance the greatest needs, like education? And the goods which have value, which are quasi-commons of the globe, include geostationary orbits, which are one of the things which allows all of this to happen, the oceans, there are a number of others. And this is a campaign which probably wouldn't achieve much in the first 2, 4, 5 years, but I think in 10 or 20 years' time it is conceivable that with advocacy and intelligence, several of these key global commons could become revenue-generating sources to finance these key global needs which do not sit within the purview of nation-states with tax-raising powers. So I'd encourage her not just to do the good practice, but actually to focus more strategically on sources of money to pay for this long term.
Michelle, you have the last word.
Well, I agree with everything everybody said, and just want to add that it's not just access to education, because it's a waste of money if that education is not going to make any difference. It has to be access to quality education, and that quality is around relevance, making the education fit to help the child to be a contributory member to their society in some way.
Well, thank you very much. I think we have to end there. Thank you to all my panelists. This has been a very stimulating conversation, actually 3 days. And thank you to all of you as well. So, to be continued.